Hey guys, it's Jane. I'm here today to talk about The Butterfly Mosque, which is a memoir by Willow Wilson. I read this right at the end of December. I talked a little bit about it in my wrap-up, but it's a book that's so full of interesting ideas. I thought it would be worth it to do a whole video just about this book. Willow Wilson is the author of Ale of the Unseen, which is one of my favourite books from last year. She also is the writer of the current run of Ms. Marvel comics. Willow Wilson is a convert to Islam. She's an American woman who grew up in a pretty secular American family, but knew herself to be a believer from quite a young age. She describes in the book that she was always attracted to monotheism and had some difficulties with certain parts of the Christian message. At university, among other things, she studied Arabic language and culture and became quite attracted to the Islamic faith. After university, she travelled to Egypt, where she worked as an English teacher for a period. It was during the journey to Egypt and her early days in Egypt when she converted and became a Muslim. So initially, she didn't tell her family, she didn't tell the people that she was working and living with. She didn't even tell the Muslim friends that she'd made in Egypt since she got there. Eventually, she had to fess up, apart from anything else, because Ramadan was coming up and she wanted to keep the fast. The early chapters of the book really concern the story of her experience of that. The book is actually not all that explicit about her motivations and the reasons for being drawn towards Islam. I imagine that is partly because it still for her is quite a personal, private thing, and also because sometimes these things just simply don't admit to intellectual examination. So I don't have any problems with the fact that the book is not a huge, long recitation of all the intellectual arguments and whatever that she went through that drew her to Islam. It's because it's not. On the one hand, it feels like becoming a Muslim in a Muslim majority country would be a straightforward thing, but actually it wasn't for a whole bunch of reasons, because she didn't have a lot of access to support structures that could understand her because of the language barrier. She had some Arabic, but not colloquial Arabic. And also there's all the specific cultural things about being a white Westerner in a non-Western country. So the other half of the story, which makes the cover, is the romance. There's a guy, an Egyptian guy, who he sort of came as a package with her job in a bizarre way. In her role in the language school, the English language school, and in her apartment, she was replacing a guy who she had previously known in the States. Was a student who was a little bit further ahead of her in her studies and who had been a friend of hers and who had had this position and the apartment before she arrived. And so he was leaving and she was taking up the role. And this guy, Omar, had been a friend of her male friend who had had the job before. And Omar had agreed on behalf of their mutual friend to look out for her when she arrived. So Omar was one of her first connections in Egypt. And it's pretty soon they realise that they have a connection, they become quite close friends. This is difficult because she is a single largely unaccompanied woman, and he is an observant single man, young man. And so how they negotiate their friendship is somewhat tricky, and that, it's a charming story. Eventually, she breaks down and tells him that she's in love with him. And at this point, she had not actually told him that she was a Muslim, which was an interesting part of the story as well. And she knows that in doing this, in saying this out loud, she is changing their relationship irrevocably, because as an observant Muslim man, it's basically a case of put up or shut up. Like, there's no middle ground. So she tells him this, and he clearly had felt the same way, although he had not said or done anything that really, made that explicit beforehand. So she tells him, and in response, he takes her hand, and she explains that this means that, essentially they're engaged, because he didn't reject her advance. And it was only at that point, once they were engaged, that she tells him that she's a Muslim, which he was most relieved to hear. So there's all of this, and the love story is quite charming. The way she describes it is not all hearts and flowers. There's clearly parts of their relationship which are really quite difficult to negotiate. However, she gives us enough of a picture of their relationship and the kind of conversations that they have and the things that they do together to make it clear why that connection came about, despite all of the difficulties and differences. But actually, for me, the most interesting part of the story is even after that. It's once they are engaged, because they can't marry straight away because, they don't want to, not immediately, and particularly because Willow has not told her family, A, that she's converted to Islam, and B, that she's been seeing this guy. And she doesn't want to do that over the phone, understandably. So her family are coming out to Egypt for Christmas. And so they determined to wait until her parents are actually in the country and they can have a face-to-face conversation, which means there is something like 6-month stretch between this climactic conversation where her life changes and when she can actually really officially do anything about it. And because of the culture that they live in, to all intents and purposes, at least initially, they have to carry on as if they are disinterested acquaintances. At this point, and I'm not 100% sure it's really clear to me why this happened, but at this point, Willow and her flatmate Jo, who is another interesting character in the book, she's another American lass who's in Egypt teaching. Jo is not a believer of any stripe, is my reading from the book. Jo and Willow move from where they had been in a relatively comfortable part of Cairo to a quite poor section of the city. Some of the most interesting part of the whole story is discussing the experience of what it was like for Jo and Willow living in this poor, not slum, but genuinely poor section of Cairo. At this point, Their Arabic is quite passable, not perfect, but quite passable. And Willow, in particular, who is an observant Muslim woman, on paper should have been welcomed and supported in this neighbourhood. The Butterfly Mosque of the title is actually a building which exists in this poor neighbourhood that they moved to. The poor neighbourhood is adjoining to a state prison, and within the grounds of the state prison, like behind the prison walls, there is this beautiful medieval mosque, which can be seen, but you can't get there. So inside the prison walls is this Butterfly Mosque. On the outside of the prison walls, actually in the neighbourhood where they live, there is one in particular, very brutalistic fundamentalist mosque, which is very, very uninviting. It must not have been long that they lived in here, but it was such a traumatic and stressful period of months that a lot of really interesting reflection flows out of this time. And I know that I've now rambled for a long time, but I'd actually like to read a couple of short passages from this part of the book. When Omar warned us that Tura was much more conservative than our old neighbourhood and said we should pay a little more attention, we readily agreed. But the fact of the matter is that we had no idea what to pay attention to. More conservative to us meant that we should both be home when male guests came over, and we should avoid wearing t-shirts or tight pants. We didn't know that more conservative meant that two single women had no business living alone, and if by circumstance they were forced to do so, they should have no contact of any kind with the opposite sex. They should make as little noise as possible and not go out at night. I don't think Omar realised this either. The Middle East is one place for men and an entirely different place for women. He was almost as puzzled and alarmed as we were by the neighbourhood's summary rejection of its two palest residents. It would take me months to understand why we inspired so much fear and to guess at the questions my neighbours must have been asking themselves. Would we cheat someone, lead someone's son astray, or call down the wrath of our infamous embassy and in doing so ruin a family? The place breathed panic, and we added to that panic, and so we were hated. And a little further on. In the meantime, I learned a lesson that was as crucial as it was debilitating. All the formal education in the world at the best universities and under the best authorities cannot teach you to understand an environment you've never seen for yourself. I've come to see the concept of expertise as something of a myth. There can be no Middle East expert who has never lived unaided in the Middle East. Using academic theory to explain and predict the behaviour of real human beings under stress is at best short-sighted. Living in that concrete box of an apartment in Tura, what I knew intellectually became less and less useful to me, and what an ordinary Egyptian knew practically became more and more so. A tolerable understanding of Safavid art and appreciation for Arabic grammar? I would have traded my entire education for an insect-free house and 3 square meals a day of clean food. The proximity of the fundamentalists who hated us and of ordinary Egyptians who feared us did have one upshot. It helped me to understand the difference between the kinds of anti-Westernism that give rise to terrorism and the kind that doesn't. In the years since 9/11, theories have been proposed linking Islamic terrorism to the poverty of many Muslim countries, despite the fact that the 9/11 bombers came from upper-class backgrounds and the terrorists in the July 7, 2005 London subway attacks came from middle-class backgrounds, and the activity of poor terrorists has been limited to Muslim on Muslim or Muslim on Jew nationalist campaigns in Israel, Palestine, Pakistan, and post-war Afghanistan and Iraq. One might argue that it simply takes more money to fly a 747 into a skyscraper than it does to load a homemade bomb into a produce truck, which means only wealthy extremists can engage in international acts of terror, and that the poor ones would if the opportunity arose. But the fact remains that violent extremists have been culled from every imaginable economic background. Clearly, the catalyst is something more complicated than income. Joe's and my neighbours in Tura did not hate us for religious reasons. They hated us because they saw us as a danger to their security. Their anti-Westernism did arise from economics, but it had no jihadist element whatsoever. In fact, I think that if we had been physically threatened, our neighbours would have rushed to our defence. Trouble with the Western government was something that they wanted very much to avoid. I think this holds true on a larger scale. Of the Middle Easterners I have met who resent the West, and specifically the United States, the vast majority resent it because they perceive it to be a military and economic juggernaut, bombing whole countries into rubble and putting local industries out of business, and succeeding where the Middle East fails. Religion never enters the discussion. On the other hand, the fundamentalists we could see from our bathroom window hated us for very religious reasons. It became clear to me, living in the shadow of that brainless minaret, how little the anger of our local extremists had to do with military America. While the situation in Iraq gave them political legitimacy and direction and a dangerous amount of emotional leverage with average Muslims, it was not the reason they were angry. They hated the America that exports culture. They were aghast at the suggestion that enlightenment could be bought on tape and that right and wrong were fluid and could change from situation to situation. They hated being made to sympathise with adulterous couples in American movies. They hated the materialism that was spreading through Egypt and the Gulf like a parasite, turning whole cities, Dubai, Jeddah, into virtual shopping malls, and they blamed this materialism on Western influence. And a little later, Joe and I were never integrated into the neighbourhood, and I doubt we could have been if we lived there for decades. But as time went by, our neighbours passed from open hostility to grudging tolerance. Occasionally they would even forget themselves and be kind, because it was far more usual for them to be kind. They were kind to one another, and the abrupt, chilly way they treated or avoided Joe and me is a mark of how much we must have frightened them. When I describe our strange relationship with our neighbours to other Americans, I ask them to imagine two single, sari-clad, Bengali-speaking Indian women of obscure purpose setting up shop in small-town Oklahoma. It's the sort of situation that might never result in harmony, but one should not take that failure as a symbol of an imagined greater failure. It does not mean that there is no hope for understanding. All it means is that in close quarters, we overthink, second-guessing our own innate assumption of common humanness, which I now think boils down to a common need for kindness. We are cruelest to those who remind us of our capacity for cruelness. It was this that made Joe's and my relationship with our neighbours so bitter. It was clear that they did not like who they became around us. I've seen the reverse as well. Westerners from the most liberal backgrounds whose beliefs are tolerant and broad-minded find themselves unable to function in a society that requires them to live so conservatively and in such limited circumstances. They are forced to resort to the ruling race social tactics that they hate in order to get by, and then they hate the Egyptians for making them hate themselves. This is the heart of the clash of civilizations, not the hatred of the other, but the self-hatred produced by the other. Okay, this is a really interesting book with lots of ideas about the West and the East, apart from being a quite compelling personal story of a couple of very interesting years in the life of a young woman. I think I'll leave it there. I hope you're all well, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.